let's talk about 135. Shakur Stevenson, one of the top fighters, maybe the top fighter at 135. He has signed a deal with Matchroom Boxing and with Riyadh Season, the Saudi Arabian company. It is reportedly a 2-fight deal. The first will be October 12th when Shakur defends his title against Joe Cordina. The next one tentatively penciled in, from what I hear, as February against William Zepeda. Like, that is the fight that they want to make in February of next year. Everyone's kind of waiting to see what Shakur was going to do next. What do you think of this decision, this path that Shakur is following now?
Well, my first question, Chris, is when and where is it not Riyadh season? Seems to always be Riyadh season, as we have come to find out.
Annual. It's 12 months a year.
Yes. That aside, as long as Shakur Stevenson's deal with Matchroom does indeed lead to him fighting William Zepeda in February or March or whenever the fight is, as long as it's next, I'm sort of fine with it, or as fine as I can be with him fighting a guy who's not a lightweight and coming off a knockout loss. We'll take the magnifying glass off of the IBF for a second and shift it over to our pal Mauricio Suleiman, who I'm sure will come up with some cockamamie, condescending rationale for this fight making sense, when it does not, because Joe Cordina is a 130-pound fighter who was knocked out by Anthony Kakachi in his last fight. There is no reasonable justification for him getting a lightweight title shot coming off of what was a catastrophic loss for him, or should have been a catastrophic loss for him. Joe Cordina is very good. He supposedly had a lot of problems making 130 pounds, but that's on him. He signed up for a 130-pound title fight,
and he kind of got cheap shot in that fight. Not intentionally, maybe cheap shot the wrong word, but he took an after the break.
Yeah.
Pretty good shot that I think changed the entire course of that fight. But your point still stands. Like, coming off a knockout loss, you are not supposed to be able to walk right into a world title opportunity.
Right. And it's really just acquiescing to whatever the promoter, and in this case, maybe Turki Al-Sheikh, wants, because they're funding Shakur Stevenson's deal with Matchroom to a degree. So you shouldn't be allowing the sanctioning, the promoters to kind of force you into a fight that shouldn't happen just because you're going to get paid for it. But that's what the sanctioning bodies typically do. Despite that they'll tell you otherwise, they're going to collect 3% of the purses from Shakur Stevenson and Joe Cordina. They're going to make a pretty penny off of this fight over there in Riyadh, and that's why they did it. Now, Joe Cordina will he'll almost certainly feel more comfortable at 135 pounds. He's a good boxer. But from Shakur Stevenson's perspective, while this was what he had to do after turning down Top Rank's deal, which would have guaranteed him approximately a minimum of $16 million over the course of 5 fights, maybe not all of which would have been on ESPN, because that's really dependent on whether ESPN renews Top Rank by the end of next June. But some of those fights would have been on ESPN and would have been very visible to boxing fans to see Shakur Stevenson. Now, the smartasses and the naysayers would obviously say, well, we don't want to see Shakur Stevenson fight anymore based on what we've seen in his last 2 fights. So that's a fair argument as well. So maybe if he's buried on a pay-per-view undercard, maybe some fans aren't going to be all that bothered by that. But from his perspective, in terms of being seen by more people, it would have made more sense to fight for Top Rank on ESPN in the short term. But this business ultimately is about money for all fighters, and should be. So despite what might be said about legacy and titles and everything, it's about feeding your family and setting up your kids, college funds, paying mortgages, all that type of stuff that fighters have to do for their families. So I don't blame him for doing it, especially after he turned down the Top Rank deal. And then supposedly there were some discussions thereafter about maybe wanting to revisit the Top Rank deal, and Top Rank maybe wasn't interested at the price point that they offered to begin with. But whatever the case, Shakur Stevenson is going to take some criticism for the second time in a row fighting an opponent who's coming off of a loss, because Artem Harutyunyan, or however you pronounce it.
Harutyunyan. Gotcha. Yeah,
there's a lot. There's a YAN and a YUN that kind of just gets mashed together in some ways. But
we've spent our capital on fixing
pronunciations. Yeah, it's based on my Olympic experience. I think I'm fixated on pronouncing fighters' names correctly, which I probably have not done. But at any rate, Artem Harutyunyan gave Frank Martin a tougher fight than people anticipated, but he hadn't fought in the year between then. and then again gets a lightweight title shot coming off of a loss. So is Shakur Stevenson just going to fight guys coming off of losses in his title defenses, or is he going to fight William Zepeda? Now, I don't think it's Shakur Stevenson's fault that he's not fighting William Zepeda next. It's my understanding, and I believe it's yours, Chris, that William Zepeda did not want to take that fight in the fall here because his wife is pregnant. She's going to have a baby. He wanted to be around for that. He couldn't focus on training.
Completely understandable. Yeah.
Yes, and yeah, you have to take a title shot when it's there. So luckily for him, and I'm not saying the birth of your child isn't more important than fighting Shakur Stevenson, but to kind of go hand in hand with the amount of money you would make from that fight. But at the same time, they're fine with it. They're fine with him fighting on the Stevenson side. They're fine with him fighting someone in the interim, presumably winning, and then going to the Zepeda fight in February. If that's what happens, then all is well that ends well, right? If that's not what happens for whatever reason, well, then we have an even bigger problem and a bigger issue with him fighting a guy who's not a lightweight, coming off a knockout loss, buried on an undercard in Riyadh. There's a lot of things not to like about Stevenson's debut with Matchroom, but the other thing I would say, Chris, is it's been portrayed a little bit that Shakur Stevenson isn't as big a star as he should be, and Matchroom's going to be able to do that for them. And Eddie Hearn's one of the best promoters in boxing. I'm not faulting Eddie, but Shakur Stevenson's all of his fights virtually were on ESPN. You're not going to get better exposure than that anywhere. There are 300 plus million people in the United States, and I don't know, 75 million of them still have ESPN subscriptions, whether it's through the ESPN Plus app or linear cable or whatever. So it's about as visible as you can be on American television. And if he didn't quite capitalize on all those opportunities, specifically the Edwin De Los Santos fight and this last fight against Haratunian, well, that's on him. And he was also brought to his hometown where in Shakur's defense, he did very well. I mean, he became a ticket seller in, a very depressed place in Newark, New Jersey, where, selling boxing tickets or tickets to anything, frankly, is not that easy. So he became a ticket seller there. If you can sell 8, 9, 10,000 tickets in your hometown, that's not nothing. It's in the American market, where you maybe don't even need one hand among American fighters of guys who are capable of doing that.
Yeah, I agree. The only question I'd ask Shakur Stevenson is what happened with Tank, because it seemed like the stars were aligning to make that fight realistic. You had Tank coming off a win right around the same time as Shakur was coming off his win. Both guys 135-pound champions. Shakur, a promotional free agent. If there has not been an easier time to make that fight. So that would be my question, because it did seem like at one point both those guys wanted it. They were talking about it. Now that Shakur has signed this deal with Matchroom, I'm not exactly sure where Tank's going to go. I mean, Jose Valenzuela's out there with a title at 140 pounds. There really isn't much to offer at 135. Isaac Cruz is certainly off the table till he gets some of his momentum back. That would be my question. Like, why did a Tank deal not come together? Because that would have been the exact kind of fight that Shakur Stevenson's been asking for.
Well, I think primarily the reason that did not come close to happening is because Gervonta Davis, the representatives, as you know, Chris, for Gervonta Davis and Vasily Lomachenko were negotiating for them to fight next. And I think they just were too far apart on percentages and all that type, all the things that go into a pay-per-view deal, and they moved away from that. And it's my understanding that maybe Vasily Lomachenko doesn't fight again. I mean, that could be the direction he heads in, but he was not pleased with the deal that was presented to him or the numbers that were presented to him. And they did spend some time on the negotiating side between Top Rank and Gervonta Davis's people on the PBC side. They did, it went on for a couple of months basically. So not every day necessarily, but they did have some conversations about it. And then I guess maybe Shakur Stevenson got lost in that mix somewhere, because Gervonta Davis thought there was a real opportunity to Lomachenko fight would happen, I guess. I mean, there's no reason they couldn't have revisited it once they realized that it would not happen. But
and that's been a while now, right? Like that's
it has. It has. But again, if the plan for Shakur is to fight William Zepeda and get him, I'm not saying Joe Cordina is an easy fight. I mean, Joe Cordina is a former world champion. He didn't look particularly good in his last fight, I didn't think, but and he hasn't proven himself in this division, but he's a real guy. I mean, for whatever that's worth, I mean, he's a real guy. So I think that was the blueprint. And of course, Joe Cordina is promoted by Eddie Hearn's company, so that made it make sense as well. So I think that's kind of what happened. I also don't think really, Chris, to be honest with you, coming off of Shakur's last two performances, which have not been the most aesthetically pleasing boxing matches that we've ever seen, I think he needs to rebuild some momentum before really making the Tank Davis fight something that people will buy en masse. Because if he goes and beats William Zepeda in February, let's say he beats Cordina, beats William Zepeda, Zepeda fight, I don't think is going to be, that's going to be a rough fight for Shakur. I don't think that's going to be an easy fight at all. So if he
That's
goes
a
and wins,
50-50 fight to me. I know
yeah,
that people think Shakur will outbox him. Some people think Zepeda is just like this wild Mexican puncher. He's not. He is not. He is an
it's
accurate
a real fight.
puncher. There is a method to his madness when he's in the ring. It's a
Yeah,
tough fight.
a real fight, Chris. And if he wins that, he reestablishes some of the momentum he probably had before he fought De Los Santos. And then you can revisit him fighting Gervonta Davis and have some reasonable expectation that that would be a commercial success. Because right now, I don't necessarily think that it would be. I mean, yeah, people would buy it because they're undefeated American lightweight champions. It's a boxer against a perceived puncher who is much more calculated and smart than maybe in some circles he gets credit for. Gervonta Davis is not some brawl, like you said about William Zepeda. He's not some brawl. He's a calculated guy who's, very economical with his punches and one of the most devastating punchers and knockout artists in the sport. So it's a contrast in styles in that way. But I do think they just kind of need to reestablish some of the momentum they might have once had. And that's really on Shakur Stevenson to do that over the course of the next